All right, it starts.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear it. Yeah.
Great. So I'll be presenting, as you heard, on the pragmatic philosophical virtues of psychedelics. Um, Obviously, the first question to ask is to why bother discussing psychedelics in the domain of philosophy? That's because philosophers often make very, very wide-ranging claims about the whole of consciousness whilst drawing from a very narrow data set. And that narrow data set is the ordinary, neurotypical, adult, wakeful human state. Now, obviously, we can't avoid the fact that we're human, or the fact that we're adult, or the fact that we're neurotypical. However, we can alter the fact that we're ordinary, and that's what psychedelic use is most useful for. Uh, and so why does this narrow data set matter? Well, because if you have an ordinary state, then that means you have an impoverished sample. And so when you draw necessary theses about the necessarily unifiedness of consciousness, or the fact that consciousness is necessarily constantly in rational control, or the fact that there is necessarily an experience of self in consciousness, these claims may just reflect that impoverished sample. So if you broaden the sample to things like dreaming, meditation, psychedelics, or neuropathologies, then you have a wider data set that can stress test any claimed necessities when you make theories about consciousness. And so the argument I put forward is that psychedelics supply both, one, invaluable data, and two, they cultivate virtues that sharpen philosophical inquiry. So this is the agenda to discuss first whether the data can be trusted, and then the virtues, then some objections, and then the payoff and the conclusion. So obviously, before we can even talk about the reports of psychedelics, we need to talk about the credibility of such reports. Now, before the psychedelic self-reports, we should talk about normal self-reports, normal introspection from normal healthy adults. So everyday untrained inner observation is usually unguided. So there's no methodology, there's no prompts. It's unscaffolded, which means we just assume that we're correct and we don't check with anything. And it's overconfident. So we typically assume a transparency about our mental states, which means that we think that we know what we're experiencing and we think we know why we're experiencing what we're experiencing. But trivially, we know that memory and attention can be significantly unreliable across a wide range of domains. So what ways can we be wrong? Well, you can misremember, so you can think you saw something that you didn't, like the amount of cards in a deck. Confabulation, you can, like in many psychedelic psychology studies, you can be forced to do something and then invent a reason which you think is why you did it, which is simply not true. Inattentional blindness, I'll come back to this one in a second, and vague concepts. So if someone asks, are you in pain? And earlier in the day, you had an extremely painful experience, perhaps when they ask you, you are experiencing some back pain, but because in comparison to the extreme pain you experienced earlier, you don't notice the pain. And so certain concepts like pain, they're vague and they shift across concepts. So for the inattentional blindness, very famous study that I'm sure all of you will know, which is participants were asked to track a basketball being passed between participants. And after the experiment, they were asked, did you see the gorilla? And most people said no, because they were focused on the basketball. They were blind with their attention to the gorilla. I would say you can do this on yourself, but now you know it won't work. So maybe you can test on a friend, and perhaps you'll see that they are attentionally blind to something that they do experience. So obviously, these all lead to concern about self-reports. So Eric Schwitzgebel claimed that standard daily introspection is massively and pervasively unreliable. Bain and Spenner therefore call for what they call introspective humility, which is that we should be humble about what we think is happening in our experience. And the particular risk for psychedelics here is that hype and misunderstanding can really be conflated with genuine philosophical insight, especially when you're in such an unfamiliar introspective state. So Bain and Spenner, they put forward these two kinds of introspection, freestanding and scaffolded. So freestanding means that there's no external checks, and therefore it's low credibility epistemically. And scaffolded means that there are external checks, which means that there's higher credibility epistemically. To be clear, neither is perfect. You can make a freestanding claim that's true, and you can make a scaffolded claim that's false. But this is just in terms of our credence in the belief. So yeah, obviously freestanding is worse than scaffolded. So an example of freestanding, you have a friend in a pub who says, that LSD tab showed me the origin of the universe. Well, there's no dose record, there's no timing, there's no corroboration. They might be sincere in their beliefs, but they don't have the framework to fully analyze their experience. And so this would be a freestanding form of introspection. Whereas if a lab participant took exactly 25 milligrams of psilocybin, it's video recorded, there's ratings every 30 minutes, there's an fMRI follow-up 7 days later, and they did it in an fMRI machine at the time. The dose is logged, the environment's controlled, there's multiple converging data streams. This would be scaffolded. So there's ways of proving that they're at least reliable somehow. So modern studies embody this concept of scaffolded introspection. This is for all psychological studies, but specifically psychedelic studies. There's standardized doses, there's tightly controlled lab settings like lighting, temperature, noise, etc. Immediate post-session debriefings. So they'll ask people just generally what happened. Then they'll ask specific things like, did this happen? And then they'll give rating scales, which is rate your experiences on these scales, like the ego dissolution index. But perhaps most importantly, there is repeated cross-validation with other studies and with neural data. So if every time someone says they experienced a loss of the self or the loss of the ego, and you noticed a decrease in the default mode network, perhaps there's some correlation there which proves to you that what they claim is happening really happens. If 1,000 people claim it and 1,000 people's brains respond accordingly, perhaps there's something genuine there. So my thesis is to put forward a calibrated trust, which is to accept that this testimony is fallible and yet indispensable for talking about consciousness. And so the two criteria are medical supervision and post-session integration. This opens the door to careful philosophical use. Now, immediately, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that other use of psychedelics is completely worthless or that only scientific studies are valuable. Of course, you can experience profound insights that stay with you and you think are completely rational, etc. However, I am saying that when used in philosophical arguments, scientific studies are more rigorous. And rhetorically, people just respond better to data than self-reports. Just personally, having to deal with my course mates who are very cynical about this topic, when I give them a quote, they don't care. When I show them the ego dissolution index, there's an initialism and some numbers, they just trust it more, which is a shame, but we have to deal with the cynics in this area. So now the 5 pragmatic philosophical virtues I think are most important from psychedelics. So first is epistemic humility. And so this is just clear in the data, high doses shake default beliefs. There's a concept of rebus, which is relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. This is predominantly for mental health studies. However, it applies generally to metaphysical beliefs, such as in Timmerman et al., which I believe was mentioned earlier. And it just shows that our general expectations of dealing with the world are changed on the psychedelics. And so the natural attitude we have towards the world, the assumption that we find ourselves in the true position, the default position to deal with reality, it feels contingent. It no longer feels necessary. It feels like it's only the case when your brain is in a certain state. And so it just allows you to deal with the world in a way which perhaps you haven't before. And this reveals an a priori overconfidence. I'm a big fan of analytic philosophy. It's very useful. However, this analytic certainty often rests on a standard phenomenological experience. So if objects seem to persist over time, if they seem to have sharp edges, perhaps in the area of mereology, if you think restricted composition is true, only some objects are truly real, they truly form. Well, when the boundaries blur and the edges become vague, perhaps you feel less confident in this view. And this is from, I think, Chris Lethby, Epistemic Innocence. And this is basically, I think, the idea that temporarily being faced with non-veridical experiences, things that aren't true, even if they feel persuasive, and even if you reject them later when you are now sober, it improves your overall relationship to truth. You see why that was wrong, but why it was persuasive, and then that just engages you to deal with true and falsity better, perhaps. And just generally, philosophical gain from this, it invites new models, and it avoids pre-theoretical dogma. So if you insist physicalism is true and you'll never change your mind, perhaps this shakes your foundation slightly. You might still retain the belief, but it at least gives you some other options. The second virtue, this ties into the first one, is phenomenological expansion. So in our standard phenomenology, as I said, objects persist over time. There's Euclidean space. Time is linear itself. But when you take a high enough dose, you have new qualia, you have new data. Perhaps your ego dissolves, perhaps you experience synesthesia, perhaps time becomes elastic or cyclical or just changes slightly. And so this breaks down some dogmas that we have about consciousness necessarily being unified or necessarily being continuous. And so you can have the experience of being everywhere at once or nowhere in particular. Importantly, you don't need to believe anything metaphysical based on this. It's just more data for what conscious states possible. And so simply, just scientifically, there's a bigger evidence pool. There's more data. There's stronger tests for theory. I see this as just clearly a positive thing. The third, and perhaps the most technical, is the de-automatization, I definitely pronounced that wrong, of perception. So our automatic patterns fall apart. The walls around you breathe and ripple. The edges of objects blur. The depth between objects distorts. I remember once lying in bed looking at my phone quite late after an experience, and the phone looked like a theater. It looked far away, even though it was right in front of my face. So depth distorts. The external world is the same, but it shows how you build the world. Your brain makes the world. Perception is felt as an active process, and perhaps this kind of undercuts naive realism, the idea that reality is just given to you unmediated and you experience it, the fact that there's no representations built, and perhaps this instead shows that reality is co-produced rather than simply received. You don't have to accept this, but simply it's just more data for the philosophy of perception. But you don't need to hold any particular view here. The fourth virtue, perhaps the most controversial, especially among analytic philosophers, is that it stress tests rationality. And so in this instance, you take a high enough dose, you're probably no longer thinking in propositional logic, but meaning remains. You can still navigate environments, you can behave intentionally, you can receive deep insights. So for example, if you've had an argument with someone about whether or not free will exists, perhaps you think it does, perhaps they've argued with you 100 times and you've never quite understood what they mean. But you can have an experience where it's no longer propositional statements. You just feel like it doesn't exist. You experience it empirically that it doesn't exist in the sense you did before. You have an insight, which you can reflect on later when you're sober, but a non-rational method of giving you some new knowledge still was present during the trip. And so it exposes the limits of reason, but still shows you that it's valuable. We don't want to get rid of reason at all. And it also shows that rationality can come in degrees. So there's a partial disruption, perhaps, but it's not totally lost. Of course, in some experiences, it might be totally lost. But it's just to show that it's not the only way of explaining things. And therefore, I promote a pluralist cognition, that emotions, imagery, intuition, they join propositional statements and logic. They're not in conflict. I mean, you can then disagree about which are more important. That's a discussion for another day, but simply just that things like intuitions or just a deep felt sense of knowing can be important, even if it's false. But it's just to accept that we do experience the world in these ways beyond propositional knowledge. And the fifth virtue, which I'll talk about the most because I think it's the most obvious, is that you experience a fluid self, a fluid sense of selfhood. And so it shows just empirically, first personally, that the experience of self can dissolve without a loss of consciousness. You can be very conscious, perhaps you can feel more conscious, or there's more content in your consciousness, but perhaps there's no sense of self that accompanies that experience. And so this grounds debates on the self. I've had many debates with course mates who insist that the experiential self is present in every moment, and they base that on their standard phenomenological experience. I show them some studies and they just deny it. And perhaps if they've experienced something, it might persuade them otherwise. Again, I'm not claiming the self is not real. I'm just saying it grounds debates, it's evidence, because the self is necessarily perspectival. The self is necessarily experiential. We experience selves. That's the data we have for it. So if you can have an experience that doesn't contain a self, that grounds debates on the self. And so drawing from Milliere in 2020, he had 6 conditions of self-consciousness. The first is cognitive self-consciousness, thinking about yourself as yourself. The second is spatial self-location. So I'm here, the world is there. This is my relationship to the world. Bodily ownership. This, the pain in my arm feels like my arm. Bodily agency. When I do this, I chose to do this. Mental ownership. These thoughts are my own. A mental agency. I'm the one thinking my thoughts. Now, from a study, I think Turnton et al., of intravenous psilocybin. They injected 2 milligrams, I think, or micrograms, I'm not sure, of psilocybin, and they would ask people how they felt. They also did an fMRI scan, I think the day of, and then 7 days later, but just asking people how they felt. So for cognitive self-consciousness, somebody said that their thinking was non-existent, their thinking was absent. For spatial self-location, somebody said my sense of where I was changed. I was no longer in the scanner. I felt like I was in a different place. In fact, this participant felt like they were in a Turkish restaurant instead of an fMRI scanner, which is very unusual. Bodily ownership, there was a certain sense of fear of not being attached to my body quite as fully as you were before. So it shows how you feel separate from your body in some sense. Bodily agency. This quote is slightly tentative. Perhaps it doesn't show exactly what I want it to, but they claim that I was at its mercy in the presence of something unstoppable, which implies that they didn't have full, agency of what was happening. Mental ownership. Someone claimed that the drug was more in control of my thoughts than I was. The drug was dictating things. So they're not controlling their thoughts. It feels like something else was. And mental agency. I just let the experience take me where it wants to take me. They're not in control of their internal experience. It feels like there's some external influence from the self, not from the brain or consciousness, but from their self. It feels like something external. Now, perhaps none of these quotes persuade you. That's fine, but it's just to show that under these scientific conditions, these are what people say. And some of these people in the study claimed to be hardcore materialists, and they found these experiences difficult to reconcile. But of course, quotes are not everything. And this is what I'm trying to get across, is that it's the data that's most persuasive. Perhaps these quotes do nothing for you, but if I show you enough data, hopefully it will change your intuition slightly. Now, some objections are very overdue to this. The two common worries I hear most often is placebo and expectation, especially in group settings or rituals. Now, we heard this earlier. I'm afraid I can't remember the name, but of the studies in Peru and ayahuasca, someone raised the question that there's a metaphysical framework that is implicit in these sessions. And how do you account for that? I mean, it seems very hard, and we know the data to show that people are far more suggestible on psychedelics, and surely that influences metaphysical beliefs. I don't know how to get around this, I will say, but there's some small ways. And the second big problem is the use of mystical and religious language to describe these experiences. So for placebo and expectation, often these tests are double-blinded. So neither the participants nor experimenters know who gets a psychedelic. The data is only after collection, and this prevents some expectancy bias. And in addition to this, there's an active control. So the placebo that people are given maybe causes mild physiological effects, like a niacin flush. So it feels like something's happening in your body, despite there being no psychedelic. And so participants can't just guess by thinking, did I feel something? That's more addressing the placebo complaint. With the expectation and suggestibility, I have to say, I don't have a good response to this. Perhaps philosophers are best accounted to take psychedelics and then deal with these because they are trained to notice things as suspicious. Perhaps not. And so this would be stronger than a regular placebo. And for mystical and religious language, so there's a concept called phenomenological anchoring, I believe introduced by Thomas Metzinger in The Elephant and the Blind, where he says we should track experiential invariance, so things that experientially don't change across experiences. So timelessness, depersonalization or ego loss, and a boundary loss between the subject and the object. So this gets rid of theological or metaphysical language and just focuses on the experience. So perhaps a Christian claims that they experience God's plan, and a Buddhist claims to experience some kind of deterministic fatalism. And perhaps the experience phenomenologically is similar, but the language and the metaphysics they use are different. But perhaps they both describe a sense of you're along for the ride with the universe, or something like that. And it shows in the study, sorry, not the study, but an analysis by Musarinjan, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, et al., that these anchors emerge across diverse belief systems. So people from different doctrinal and philosophical backgrounds use the same kind of language despite framing it in a different way. So perhaps there's some things that are shared across all experiences. And this shows that there's comparable data even when the vocabularies differ. So perhaps that's the way of getting around it. The takeaway I want to leave you with is that handled with calibrated trust, psychedelics are scientific instruments that expand our conceptual and evidential toolkit. They do not inherently imply wild metaphysics. They make philosophical inquiry more sophisticated. Thank you. Here are some of the sources I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Finn. So you'll get questions if anyone has question. See, it's from the room. Yeah, we have a question there.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Like, Finn, if
You
you
can come
yeah,
here
you
if
can come here.
Please, yes,
Or I
yes, yes,
can-
come here
Yeah,
and
yeah.
ask me directly.
I have a question about the scaffolded versus freestanding introspection.
Sure.
And you gave the example of the freestanding of someone who said that LSD showed me the origin of the universe. And I'm wondering how a statement like that can be supported in a scaffolded setup. Like how do you scientifically prove that what he's saying is legitimate in some way?
Sure. So obviously this is a huge problem. None of this is easy to talk about, especially given the nature of the experiences. I would say you kind of can't in a way that confirms the claim, but perhaps if they were under scaffolded conditions, there would be a way of translating what they mean by that into something, a phenomenological anchor. So they describe the nature of the experience rather than making the claim that they did about, seeing the origin of the universe. Perhaps we have good reason to be suspicious of claims like that, but we have less good reason to be suspicious of the phenomenology of the experience. So if someone similarly claims, God spoke to me, I think you can translate that to, I had the experience of what I interpreted as God speaking to me. And there's something perhaps you can scaffold about the second claim that they felt the experience, but is impossible to scaffold about the original claim that the experience actually was God talking to them. So I think perhaps it's intractable. These kind of statements you can't prove. I mean, similarly, if I tell you my water bottle, I'm looking at it and experience yellow, you don't actually, you can never prove that I'm seeing yellow. It doesn't matter what evidence you give neurologically or how you can scaffold it. So there's always this gap epistemically that we can probably not overcome. But I just want to say we can get closer and further away. There is better and worse evidence, but none of it's perfect. So I think perhaps we can't scaffold a claim like that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there any? Yeah, there's one more question, please.
Greetings, Finn. Thanks for this presentation. I'm actually quite excited by it. I'll probably ask you for a copy of it. Here's my question. I want to see if I can actually pack it down compact enough to make sense. But it's coming from this direction. Seeing as how, I'll just say generally like this, nowadays philosophy, it's a bit of a, I'm gonna kind of a dead mental undertaking on the part of most people who study philosophy, as opposed to, let's say, Parmenides and Socrates, and back in the day where that was actually a living discipline. It was embedded in life. It had skin in the game and meat on the bones. And right now it's kind of a dry academic thing. And why I'm saying that is because it's led to a certain rigidification and crystallization of a language that ultimately, as you said, it does come from our ordinary adult, neurotypical, wakeful human perspective, yes? So even as we break out of these confines, we are inherently still structured by, let's say, 2,000, 2,500 years worth of application of philosophy that has become, let's say, petrified. So it's all of a sudden we break open to a cognitive capacity base that is 1,000-fold of what we have right now. And then we kind of slowly revert back to the same old philosophical concepts and structures. If you see what I mean. So even in, it's kind of almost built in even in the investigation of this, that we're still using the same language and structures, which are inherently inapplicable to the much more fluid and dynamic and multidimensional space that is accessed in these experiences. So how do you reconcile the tension of these two? Otherwise, it is just the servant, emitting opinions on the, let's say, the magnitude of something well above its pay grade, so to speak.
Well, I think these kind of experiences are ineffable. I think we have an inability to describe them. But I think, for example, I have the inability to describe red to you. I don't know how to describe red to you. I can just hope that you've experienced similar things. And so if more people are encouraged to have these kinds of experiences or to imagine them or empathize with them or conceptualize them, perhaps we can have some shared understanding. And again, I understand our language is imperfect here and our analytic structure is imperfect here. For example, in the literature, in the scientific literature, the term oceanic boundlessness is used. And when I describe that to my analytic minded friends, they laugh at this term. But perhaps that is the best term for this kind of concept. And it's still not perfect. But I think we can get better and closer. And I think ultimately that's what it's about. It's not going to be perfect, but if we can encourage people to just take the phenomena seriously, and of course it feels profound when you're having the experience, but we have to accept nobody can access that experience other than you. And we have this shared language, we have this shared framework. And perhaps the dry analytic philosophy is the best way of taking it seriously. If we try and get people on board with the data, try and encourage them to be more open-minded, perhaps try them themselves. I think you're right, we can't escape the scientific analytic framework that we're in. We can try to, but I think if we're in the business of trying to persuade Western academia to take it seriously, we have to stay in those frameworks. But I think introducing terms such as oceanic boundlessness, philosophical anchoring, phenomenological anchoring, ego disillusion indices, just ways of making it seem more rigid and trying to take from this, I don't want to say realm because that's metaphysical, but taking from this kind of experience and putting it into this framework, perhaps we can get closer than we were before. And that's all we can hope for, I think.
Agreed. I'm with you on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
And there was one more question from inside the room, please.
Hello, Finn. My name is Anna Maria. Congratulations for the presentation and also to the people that organized this beautiful event. I'm asking from the perspective of modern mind, because we think very rational, as my colleague earlier said. So now in quantum field and also in self-development, we use a lot the term coherence between mind and heart. How do you think from your research that this can help a human being have the state of coherence, like not having the self conflict anymore and living a better experience in life, manifesting easier and having this state of coherence in his life?
Well, obviously, certain metaphysical beliefs can aid this, like we've seen in earlier presentations. Perhaps if you accept idealism, you just have a happier life. But I think remaining agnostic about specific metaphysical claims, I think just these kind of experiences just allow you to approach the world with an openness that you didn't have before. It's less rigid than you had before, and you feel just some wonder and awe. We really don't know how things work. We really don't know what the self is. We really don't know what consciousness is. We really don't know what matter is if you're talking quantum mechanically. I mean, fields, wave functions, it's not clear what any of this means. And I think I don't have a clear answer, but I just think this kind of it just opens you up, and it's a process of engaging with everything you encounter with some humility, and that includes other metaphysical views or religious views perhaps, and just being charitable to the things that people tell you. I'm afraid I don't have a clear answer to what you're saying. I think it's very personal, and I think as long as you just try to be more open than how you were earlier, I think that's what we can hope for.
Yeah, for sure, it's a lifetime work, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if there's no other question from the room, let's see. Yeah. So Yushi has a question. Please go.
Yes, again, I have questions. Yes, my previous point was similar as the first commentator locally there. I'm a bit concerned about this, a bit kind of like scientific idea of validating experiences with science, like the scaffolding thing, because, for example, fMRI, it only shows which brain areas activate, and you cannot validate or verify the contents of an experience in that way. For example, a person has seen the origin of the universe. An fMRI scan cannot validate that kind of idea, even if that insight would happen inside the scanner and it would be queried and probed with questionnaires right after. So the scaffolding thing, I didn't really get that. But now in your response to the other comment, I sort of understood better that the question is about the interpretation of the experience and the content of the experience. Like you can focus better on the experience itself, like what happened when you question it simultaneously in real time when it happens. And maybe even fMRI could somehow help in that, for example, self-loss correlating with the DMN loss of activation or something like that. So it will like cross-validate the content of the experience. So the scaffolding would apply mainly to interpreting the experience or not interpreting. I mean, like the person would become aware that they have had this specific kind of experience of having seen the origin of the universe, but they should somehow become aware that it doesn't follow from this experience that they have seen the origin of the universe. Like from the premise that you have had a noetic experience that feels really true and real, it doesn't follow that the experience was true and real. Like this, I don't know how this is related to scaffolding.
Well, the experience might be real, but it might not be true. And it's obviously very hard to do this. I do think, and I tried to make clear near the beginning that what I'm not saying is that only scientific studies are valid. I think in terms of personal arguments, so for example, if you personally have an experience of talking to God, that should be the best evidence that someone could give you. There's no like rational argument that should persuade you. And so if you think you've had this experience, I think you don't have a duty to prove to anyone that you've had the experience or that it's true. But I think a lot of this is about rhetoric. So when we're trying to, in the framework that we're in, persuade other people to take it seriously, any way of scaffolding it is going to help. And so if you just talk about some experience you had personally, I mean, it depends who surrounds you, but it typically doesn't persuade people. And if you want to talk about something like the metaphysical claim about self-consciousness not being necessary for consciousness, well, then showing these data, even if, like you say, the fMRI data doesn't prove what the experience was, but if you can correlate reliably that, if you, I know it's not true, but if you have pain and see fiber fires each time, well, if you can prove that every time someone claims to have an ego dissolution, this network decreases, well, it's about just rhetoric, trying to persuade other people to take it seriously. But I agree, the experience itself can't be, the veridicality, the truth of the experience can't be scaffolded.
But what is the person trying to convince the other ones of? Like, it's no point that they would convince them of the experience, that they had that experience. No reasonable person would deny that. But what every reasonable person can do is deny the content of the experience or the validity of the experience. For example, that, okay, I understand that you had the experience of the origin of the universe. I totally get it that you had that experience and it feels real, but it doesn't follow that you saw the origin of the universe. You just cannot escape this because this philosophical argumentation, it just doesn't follow. No matter how much you have empirical data or ratings, like every person who has taken LSD, they have seen the origin of the universe and they rate all these psychometric scales and you have numbers and all they have activation acts in their brains. And it doesn't follow that they have seen the, So like
Yeah.
from a philosophical perspective, it just doesn't follow.
Yeah, I do think it's important to distinguish between content and structure. Perhaps this is a false bifurcation between concepts, but I think so. Something like the origin of the universe would be more content, but I think the dissolution of experiential self is more like structure, and I think structure perhaps is easier to accept than content because we know that under different circumstances the brain can be damaged and the structure of experience can be totally changed. But if someone is has a schizophrenic delusion and claims to see an elephant in the room, well, we can say that the content's wrong. But if someone has memory loss or just some other thing that's more about structure, perhaps we're more inclined to believe that than specific content. So I think that there is I mean, I don't know. I think it is very hard to talk about any of this in terms of persuading others.
Yeah,
I'm
but
sure I
like,
haven't answered your question well, but yeah.
no, I get it. I get it. So the point is that you can convince others of the content of your, or I mean, of the phenomenology of the experience, but not its truth. Because
Basically, yeah.
the truth is a philosophical or scientific question, which doesn't rely only on the content of the experience. But okay, that's just clarification regarding the virtues, if I may continue for a while. The first virtue of humility, I think that would naturally follow from a psychedelic experience that this is a bit like what Leteby argues and others, that the mental models become opaque because of psychedelics, relaxation of the prior stuff and everything, that people would see their models as models, that this reality is just a model and it's not like really real. But I think this is an empirical question whether this is so actually. And it appears that in many cases people become more convinced of their ideas. And also some other, like this virtue 3 was explicitly about this cognitive diffusion or model opacity. So this is also something that should be tested empirically, whether that is the case or not.
Yeah, I think obviously people do. If you're already primed to, let's say, have certain religious beliefs and you have an experience that you feel matches that, I think if anything, you have good reason to think that your belief is more true, although that won't persuade anyone, and I wouldn't accept that. So I think, yeah, of course, people can be stuck. But this is why I say there's philosophical virtues, and I sort of mean it for philosophers. I would hope that a philosopher would understand that their experience does not necessarily prove anything, and so I do think, in addition to scaffolding, is perhaps having people who are best equipped to deal with this. I don't want to say the average person's not well equipped to deal with this, but perhaps some people are better or worse at dealing with false beliefs or delusions, or looking at them for what they really are. There's a sense you can, train yourself phenomenologically, perhaps, to purely observe things and not identify with them. And I do agree, it's an empirical issue. But I think the virtue need not apply to everyone, as long as it applies to some people. But then obviously, who are the right people? How do you know it applies to them? Why should you trust them just because they say so? Yeah, none of this is perfect. And I don't claim that it's perfect. I just hope we can get further away from the Western academic cynicism about these experiences, and we can deal with the empirical problems later. But that's obviously not satisfying, but that's unfortunately my response.
Yeah, I totally understand. And yes, thank you. Very good presentation. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for both of you. And thank you, Finn, again. And we're going to go to a break until... No, we're not going to go to...
Yeah, we'll just move on to the next speaker and
Okay.
speakers after.